Good evening, and welcome to each and every one of you. Thank you for your interest in tonight's program, Caution, Negative News and Our Health. This is the 45th event of our 7-year series. My name is Scott Warnock. I'm the Executive Director at the Huronia Community Foundation. And in the past, I may have been Old Scotty at CKMP and at Kicks FM, or the Mayor of Tay Township. But tonight, I'm your moderator for this Our Health program. Thank you very much. We're very pleased that you're joining us this evening here at the Midland Cultural Center, at home on Rogers TV, or streaming the broadcast live on your electronic device. Tonight we have 4 speakers, and I'd like to introduce them. First of all, Carrie Moran, Morning News and co-host Pure Country 106. Rebecca Barnes-Staple, Community Health Team Manager, Interim Manager at Chigamick Community Health Center. Jason Rayner. Jason is the Vice President, Strategy, Communications, and Stakeholder Relations, Royal Victoria Regional Health Center. And Glenn Robitaille, who appeared on Our Health Resilience in February of 2021, is back by popular demand. Glenn is a registered psychotherapist at Waypoint Center for Mental Health Care. Now, there are more detailed biographies in our little brochure, which you can download electronically. Save a few trees along the way. And also, there are a number of articles, reference articles, that I think you may find fascinating that you can read when you go home this evening. It'll give you a greater insight to what we'll be discussing over the next 90 minutes. A few collective thank yous to get underway. The Our Health Advisory Committee, first of all, specifically Laureen Hilderly and Ted Shivers. Ted is right down here in the front row. Let's hear it for them. And Laureen is right over there. They were the 2 that twisted my arm to be here this evening and be your guest moderator. Our 7 local sponsors, who I will acknowledge individually a little later on in the program. The extraordinary staff at the MCC, Michelle for promotions, Glenn for the AV setup, and the volunteers at the box office that help with the setup on the stage, and they are here tonight. Let's hear a big round of applause for all of them. And last but not least, Rogers TV. Josh for recording and broadcasting all the sounds we make and the images we project. So Josh, thank you very much up in the booth. Now, during the 90 minutes that we have together here this evening, I'll engage in a discussion with the speakers about negative news from both a professional and a personal perspective. Included in our discussions are some of the questions that interested viewers have sent in advance. We have some questions from members of the advisory panel, and I have a couple of my own that I want to throw in as well. So how did we get to this evening? When the Our Health Planning Committee was discussing topics for the series this year, the news headlines were full of the war in Ukraine. We were also still facing the ramifications of the global pandemic, new economic concerns, and the regular stories we consider quote-unquote bad news were still part of our daily lives. The idea grew for a session to help people who may face added worry, anxiety, or other worsening mental health concerns with the barrage of disconcerting world and other events making headlines. And today, with our cell phones and other technology, how we receive news has changed, and it's rapid. With social media and online access making the traditional newscast at only certain times of the day or waiting for the daily or weekly newspaper to arrive as a thing of the past. I remember when news was something that broke up the music for 5 minutes when I was at the radio station. And Carrie, when you were at the newspaper, right, it was once a week.
That's right.
Boy, how things have changed. What we hope for you tonight is to hear from a variety of experts about their different experiences with the media and news. We don't just plan to talk about ways to cope, we also want to hear about the good things that are part of the news that we consume each and every day. We've brought together a great group of people that include mental health, healthcare, communications, and media professionals to weigh in on this topic. This is not meant to be critical of the media. Reporting the news is their job. We're here to consider many different views and opportunities, and for you to perhaps find a tool or tip that you can use the next time you go online or turn on the news. I know that I'm looking forward to tonight's discussion to learn and grow. Are you excited? Yeah. Ready, gang?
I'm ready.
Carrie.
Yes.
Who I've known for well over 30 years.
Yeah, I think it has been that.
Okay, Carrie, what are the challenges that you face personally being the quote-unquote messenger to the local radio listener?
Well, some days are harder than others, and some issues are harder than others. Sometimes it's, you go into the radio station first thing in the morning, you turn on your computer, you start with your press releases. I'm a one-person newsroom, so that's a challenge in itself to get the news together and on time and out, into the community by 6 o'clock in the morning. So I'm there very early, and a lot of it comes through police reports. So we get the bad news right from press releases that come in, and some days it's overwhelming, the amount of negative news, the amount of bad news, and we can't even cover all of it on the radio. So we pick what we think is what I think, because I'm a one-person newsroom again. I pick the stories that I think impact our listeners the most, the things that they may have been, there may have been sirens downtown Midland, and people turning on the news might want to know what that was all about. And there's a variety of ways that we gather it. Again, press releases. I actually use social media and people's eyewitness accounts. And then, with journalistic principles, you have to more than one source for your information. So it's a bit of a process first thing in the morning. And this goes on every day, Monday to Friday for me. Now I'm Monday to Friday, so that's kind of nice. Obviously, the news cycle doesn't normally work that way, but sometimes it's a lot, and it's every day. I can't turn it off. It's my job to go in and to report what is going on, so that can be quite challenging. I've had, I said earlier that some issues are harder than other issues, and I've had people, particularly during the pandemic, the trucker convoy protests, people very angry about the news that I'm relaying. And they phone, and I keep the calls are recorded. I do that and then pass it along to somebody who, people look out after my safety, because there have been some serious threats, Over the course of the pandemic, I couldn't get away from it. Every day I went into work, I turned on the computer, and there it was, and I had to relay the information the public health was giving out to people, and some people really didn't like the information that I was relaying and kind of blamed me for that. And I would say, listen, I am only telling you what, our public officer of health has said to tell people. That's my job. I want to try and keep as many people safe as possible. So I take that responsibility fairly seriously. Again, one-person newsroom. So sometimes people say, well, why isn't there more good news in your newscast? And I always try to end on a positive note. I usually have a lifestyle story, perhaps, something from entertainment as my last story, because I try and end on a little bit of a positive note. And people say, well, why don't you have more positive news? And there are a lot of good positive news stories. But again, I'm a one-person newsroom. And frankly, we just don't have the resources Okay, so I'm plucking the low-hanging fruit, is I guess the best way that I can say it. When a police report comes in and something terrible has happened, it's very easy for me to take that information and disseminate it, as opposed to phoning somebody up and searching out a more positive story and getting it on there. Now, I try my best, and if you go to our website, you'll see a lot of positive stories there. In fact, I counted before I came here tonight. Of the last 10 stories that I posted, 6 were actually positive news stories. You know, so that's something that I try to do, and then I share it on social media. Sadly, positive news stories, when you post them to social media, the way I feel about it is that's where they go to die, because nobody likes comments. They just don't get shared. They don't have the reach, sadly, that a negative news story will have. As a one-person newsroom, it's difficult because when I was at the Free Press and we had more people in our newsroom, you know what, you could trade off. Somebody could go do the bad news story on the one day, and then somebody else could do a happy story, or, you know, a less controversial story, or, you know, falling asleep in council story, perhaps. But we had that. We can bounce these things off of each other. With a one-person newsroom, it's hard to get away with. And I have some coping techniques that I use, but I really have to look after my own mental health.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
I think the phrase "don't shoot the messenger"
Yeah.
pretty well sums up your existence these days. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Rebecca, what are the effects of negative news on our health? It's a fairly generic question, but I'm sure you've got some specifics for us.
I do, Scott. Thanks. Well, I think you've probably explored in this time before, our health time, that the things that we do, the things that we choose to pay attention to, the things that we look at, have many ramifications on our health. And the news has become much more negative over time. I was doom scrolling preparing for this through the negative effects of news, and it's really quite phenomenal.
So, define the term.
Doom scrolling. Okay, so this has to do also with the way we consume news. So some of the reports, like I think the Rutgers report is shared in the resources for tonight. As you mentioned, it's no longer a weekly newspaper or watching the nightly news at 6. Now we access the news on our personal devices, and we're able to sit and read the news endlessly for hours if we wish. So doom scrolling is when you start looking at a topic and then it just spirals. You just keep going. So your attention is fixated on something. And one of the problems with that is that you feel that you are doing something. You feel that you are engaging with something. And our brains are trained to look for, something that's important. If you feel there's a threat or a danger, you're going to keep seeking out more information. But you really aren't able to do anything about the information you're consuming. So it's a state of passive consumption. And it leads to something that's called learned helplessness. And learned helplessness is when you're having a barrage of negative information that's causing an increase in your stress response, an increase in cortisol, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And yet you feel you should do something, so you just keep reading more negative news. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle. And if you think about, maybe you go home and you're tired, you've had a long day and you want to relax, and you pick up your phone, or you open a newspaper and you feel that you're relaxing by consuming media, but actually the images and the stories that you're consuming may be increasing your stress levels. So it's the opposite of relaxing. It's actually taking you into a place where you're in a heightened stress response. So yeah, the news can really have an impact on our health. And one of the stories I was reading, actually, I was looking at some of the research that was done. There was a team that was gathering some mental health research in the United States, and it was right around the time of the Boston Marathon bombing. And they followed up with people like 6 months, a year after that event occurred, and they actually found that people who consumed news of that event had worse mental health outcomes later than people who were actually at the event, or even people for whom they had perhaps lost a friend or someone had been injured at the event. So people who consumed, I think it was up to 6 hours of media in the weeks after. we're more profoundly affected. So it's something really to think about, because we can exercise choices in where we direct our attention. We can make choices about the type of media that we consume, or when and how much we consume. And I don't know if we really think about the negative implications for our health, but they're really quite profound. So I think that there's lots of options about how we can create balance in our lives, but I guess that's probably what we're talking about later.
That's going to be later on.
There.
Stay tuned for that.
Okay.
Jason, what have been the challenges that you faced? You're fairly new to your job at Royal Victoria. What have been the challenges that you've faced in balancing the good and the bad regarding the news around the local healthcare system?
Yeah, it's a great question, Scott. And thankfully, a number of my colleagues helped me prepare for tonight, so I'll rely on their information and their experience. You know, at the beginning of the pandemic in particular, there was a real desire to seek out sources of truth, right? What's really going on here? And who can you listen to, right? Where are the experts? How do you know what's real? How do you know what's true? How do you know what's tested? And we were all experiencing that. And so there was a real, it's particularly in the healthcare system, there was a real desire to be clear, concise, and not editorialize, right? Just, look, this is how many people died. And every day we would tell you, this is how many people died. And, you know, over time, of course, everybody felt like we don't really want that information anymore. But the healthcare system was struggling, I think, or at least, you know, many of us in these roles, about how to change the channel, so to speak, while still making sure that you had your source of truth, right? That, you know, you become to rely on certain doctors who were speaking or other kinds of media that were providing you with that critical information. And so there was a conscious effort, at least at RVH, the hospital, to start to supplement with more of the good news, right? More of the really amazing healthcare work that was going on, which really seemed to help people balance a little bit better the challenges of the pandemic early on, because there were amazing things happening, right? I mean, we sort of forget, or maybe we don't, if it happened to you, or your family members, but there was amazing care being given, and there were people recovering, and, you know, I think that we sort of lost sight of that sometimes, right? Based on what was going on and how negative it was. So we've continued with that, you know, recognizing that in a vacuum, you know, if the only thing you're hearing is the negative, then, you know, it's natural for you to start to, you know, have some of these challenges that we're going to talk about tonight. So we're consciously, purposely trying to think about what are the good news stories and the amazing, you know, miracle is maybe the wrong term, but, you know, how there's amazing things going on in our healthcare system, and how do we share that, you know, those wonders that are going on every day, right? And because we hear from patients who will tell us, you know, either through our patient's experience portal or other ways, or tell the nurse or tell the doctor, you know, this is incredible care that I've received, and, you know, they don't get the retweets or the, you know, the likes, and those stories don't necessarily get shared. But how do we start to capture them and then look for them and communicate them in a way, and I think this is our roles, you know, those of us who are communicators, to make it effective, right? So how do we tell you a story about a patient, about an amazing, you know, care, when we know that if we haven't caught you in the first 10 words, you're not going to read it, right? Like, it's next, you know, 140 characters, we can barely read that. It's all headlines. So there is a real emphasis on trying to communicate in an effective way, and, you know, we try to achieve that. I don't know that we always do, but we are working on it, and we think it's really important to keep doing that, to balance those stories, so that people understand and can connect with those people that are also going through similar experiences, right? Because I think if there's an upside to some of the social media connection, it's that you can reach out and connect with people that are, you know, otherwise strangers, right? But they may be going through something, or they may have gone through something that's really impactful and can share that experience with you. And I think in healthcare particularly, that's a really important part of the patient journey that we want to try to support from the communication side.
Thank you, Jason. And Glenn, trauma from negative news. Your thoughts?
Well, let me say first that when you're speaking of trauma often people think about an event being a traumatic event. The truth is, events are not traumatic. The way we process events can be traumatic. So people experience the same thing differently. Rebecca was referencing that Boston Marathon bombing and how people who read the negative news were more traumatized by that and later showed higher levels of acute stress in larger numbers than individuals who were actually there. Many of the people who were there, part of that event, probably got into action helping people, and so they're distracted, they're doing something. So there's a thing called negativity bias. And what happens with that is that we are naturally drawn more to the negative than we are to the positive. I mean, think of the model who may be a perfect demonstration of the female physique and is admired and sometimes worshipped by others, and then all she can see is that flaw in her chin that she thinks she needs to fix because the power of the negative is so much more. Or I'm sure the people of Philadelphia this week are suffering more than the citizens of Kansas City are celebrating, because the joy of victory, as great as it is not nearly as powerful on the psyche as the agony of defeat, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, if you think about things like when you got married, the joy you had on that day, or some other, you graduated, you received the diploma or the degree, that's great, you know, and 2 days later, what's next, you know? You lose someone that you love, and it's months and sometimes years because the negative impact is stronger. So when you think about the impact of the news, when we watch news, you know, for some people, it's immediate. They see the destruction in Syria and in Turkey, and they see images of people that are being affected by that, and, you know, children being hauled out. They can't take it, they turn off the news, they move on to something else. There are others who are drawn to it, and they think that they're managing it okay, like the people who were witnessing the Boston Marathon, and then later that they find there's this cumulative effect that is eroding their ability to cope. And it's like that commercial you see on television about post-traumatic stress disorder with veterans, and they talk about the frog in the kettle. That really isn't true. A frog will not jump out of a pot of boiling water, but boil to death. But it is a good illustration of how stress can build up over a period of time and very imperceptibly affect our ability to cope. And the next thing you know, you're experiencing a failure to cope and having a real major problem. So the news itself, not traumatic. I mean, some of these people who cover the news, like I'm a watcher of CNN now and then and the CBC, I don't know how these people go over the same story over and over and over again, like they do, and not be affected by it, and they probably are being affected by it. So I think that's what we need to keep in mind when we think about trauma. There's a personal dynamic to it. It's how I personally respond to an event. So, you know, some people have a resilience level that they're overwhelmed by a hangnail, and there are other people who can walk through fire and come out on the other side pretty much unscathed. So there's a lot of factors that play into ability to cope and whether or not you are traumatized by an event. And so later on, if we get the chance, I'll talk more about how you actually identify your ability to cope and access it in order to help you through crisis. Yeah.
Thank you, Glenn. And we also have to realize that a lot of this, I don't know if it starts when we're just little kids or whatever, but how many people, when you're driving along the highway, slows down because there's a car stopped on the side of the road? It's the natural, it's not an accident. The car is stopped and everybody slows down like they have never seen a parked car in their entire life. But it's on the highway, so I'm going to slow down. Because you'll go along and you'll say, oh, it must be an accident up there because the traffic's not moving. And you go by and you're going, there are no ambulances, there are no tow trucks. Someone's fixing a flat tire. So, but I wanted to see it for some strange reason. Carrie, you mentioned the fact that you're a one-person newsroom. I can relate to that because that was the way it was many, many years ago, and it really hasn't changed when it comes to radio. But when Rebecca and I were meeting to have our discussion, we were talking about how the news has changed, okay? And if you go back and if you read the Heronia past and present stuff that's on Facebook and everything else, they'll show you like a news story from 1920. And the front page was Mr. and Mrs. Brown got married. That was the lead story on the front page of the newspaper. And that was what the news was all about. It was current events and talking about the community. That's not the way it is these days because, let's face it, that doesn't make news. That's not exciting. That's not, oh, I've got to stay tuned to find out if they're still married. So that doesn't really work. But news has changed. So for Carrie and for Jason, so I guess what is the news and how has it changed? Not only in the way you deliver it, but as you're saying, you know, how do I pick the low-hanging fruit? How do I make sure that my newscast is balanced? Sometimes, and the same thing in your promotional stuff, Jason, about the hospital, sometimes it has to be challenging.
To pick what you're going to be reporting on?
Because
Yeah.
the people out in the audience, the listener or the community, you're their conduit or their connection to the world, for lack of a better phrase. So what you're sharing with them, because you're on early in the morning, may indeed set them up for the whole day.
Yes, and it has changed. It really has, Scott, in terms of, you know, people when they turn on the radio, a lot of people, you know, their alarm goes off when I'm just starting the news, you know, whether it's 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, whatever time it is. So the first thing that I want to be able to give you information. If you're in the kitchen and you're wondering what should I put the kids in today? Do they need a coat? Do they need an umbrella? Do they need boots? That's the first thing I'm going to hit you with is that information. So you can be pretty confident that you know, downtown Midland did not explode overnight because I'm talking about the news and whether the buses are running at this time of the year. You know, the weather. It's a Canadian thing, I think. And then after that, I try to. Again, when I'm sifting through, there's the stories that come across that all the time, drug busts, domestic disputes and assaults, and drugstore robberies. But and those kinds of stories, because they're so everyday, I hate to tell you, but they're so everyday that they don't always get into my news because really it doesn't impact you unless there's been a rash of break-ins. Say there's been a rash of break-ins in a certain area of town that I can tell you about. So, you know, you're going to want to go out and check your car and make sure your car is still there and it's not broken into. So those are the things that I try to touch on. And then, of course, there's the big national stories and provincial stories. So what is Doug Ford doing today? What did he do yesterday? What did he say? Same with the Prime Minister and you know, that sort of thing. And then always I try to leave you with something a little light before I get into sports. So that's how I build a newscast. But yeah, it has changed. You have to. I think we were talking about it before we came up here tonight, and it's like if you're not captivating somebody within the first 10 words, the fear is, and the fear not for me so much, but my bosses are. The fear is that you're just going to switch and go to a different station and you know, listen to something else, you know, another newscast, and get the information that you want. So that's how I put my news together. I try to do the best that I can. Again, one person, so I don't have a lot to. I do bounce things off of my co-host, but you know, generally speaking, he can be a little frivolous. So, you know, when it comes to news, I'm kind of on my own. But my role there is the information. That's what I want to give you. I want to give you that information to get up and on your way and just let you know that the world is still here. There's some bad things going on, but it's still here, and try to leave you with something a little positive. But it's really hard sometimes to go from an earthquake where, you know, nearly 40,000 people died to McDonald's has a new McNugget with no chicken in it, right? Literally today.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
Well, being an old former morning man, we can be frivolous from time to time.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. The news person was basically the straight man,
Yeah.
or the straight person on the show. That was kind of the way it was done, which was not the best way, but it was, back in those days, it was good radio, unfortunately. Times have changed, thank goodness. Jason.
Well, and I think I would add, Scott, that one of the challenges is the complexity of the world that we live in today, right? So, many of you would have seen, everyone saw that, the Prime Minister announced this additional funding for healthcare, for example. And, don't we get immediate responses on our social media about fabulous, this wait list that, I've been on for a year and a half is going to go away tomorrow. So when can I make my appointment to come in? And, as if the Prime Minister's announcement would translate to an immediate, but at the same time, we respond sort of saying, well, yeah, because we don't have the time, the newscasts don't have the time. How do you explain the complexity of the healthcare system funding model, in a tweet, right? I mean, you just can't, other than to say, keep waiting, we'll get to you when we can. So I think that's part of the challenge of that news is the complexities, the interconnectedness, but we all don't have the attention span or the time, frankly, to dive into the level of detail to really understand these things. And I think, as communicators, part of our role is to distill this down, right? So what does it mean for me, and what can I do about it, right? So, if the Premier is going to be making a decision about how to spend Prime Minister's money? It's not the Prime Minister's money. Anyway, you know what I mean. How is that, where does that money go? Where are the priorities? How do you get involved, or how do you get activated, or how do you connect into the story that can make a difference? Because, the irony is that some of those decisions do get made, in a way that is not as complex as you might think it is, right?
Thank you. This is for Rebecca and for Glenn. You've talked about coping, some of the negative influences. There's your mental health and there's your physical health. And sometimes people will say, if you're in a funk, go for a walk, or go for a run, or go to the gym, or do something. So you kind of have that balance in your life between physical and mental health. How do you cope? How do you strike that balance?
Well, I'll take this one to start.
Okay.
If that's all right, Glenn.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, we actually, we are about to expand at Chigamik on an initiative it's called social prescribing. And it's really about balancing a medical and a social model. So Chigamik is a community health center. We really think about health very holistically. So it's mental, it's physical, it's affective, it's spiritual, it's all of these things. And there's greater recognition even within healthcare and healthcare funding, thankfully, that these kinds of holistic aspects are really important to consider in terms of helping us become healthier and helping us stay healthy and well. So we actually were visited today by a very positive news program. The Thread from TV Ontario was at Chigamik today, and we also visited Askinonia, and looking at some of the things that are happening in the community that we can become involved in that support our health in a really broad sense. So it's true, getting out and going for a walk, paying attention to something different, paying attention to something that is within your control, that you can do something about, is really important for supporting our health, broadly speaking.
Glenn?
Well, that last point that Rebecca made, I think, is really critical because anxiety is all about loss of control. Even a fear of death is a fear of the ultimate loss of control. So the antidote to that is to control something. So identifying what you can control is always a helpful way to reduce anxiety. And so that's what we actually try to help our staff do. When you work in a mental health facility, particularly in a forensic mental health facility where there are some constant stressors occurring every single day, and that's a part of your life, this work-life balance thing is really, really important. And so knowing what you can control and what you can't control in terms of how you reach out and work with others is really important. Recently, I read a book called Compassionomics, written by two medical doctors in the States. One's name is Tretsiak, and I can't remember the other one. But the key point that I took from this book, and it's a really good read for those who enjoy reading scholarly works on things like this, is that if a person practices only 60 seconds, actually it was 30 seconds of true compassion, that's it. If you give a person eye contact, observation, and attention, and reflect back to them concern, the people who do that actually reduce their levels of burnout, experience more well-being. So again, it's not about the environment. You can work in a really tough environment. If you're focused on self-protection, rather than focusing on the other person and actually giving them something, self-protection takes work. Compassion doesn't if you're doing it correctly. So that's a coping strategy, is actually see the people around you, actually talk to them, actually hear them, make that human contact, that human connection. So that's one thing everybody can do. It's really critically important if you're working in a high-stress environment. People who work as EMS, who encounter all of these things all of the time, that's a compassionate role. But you can either withdraw from it or you can focus on being really present, and then you can walk away from it then feeling you've done what you could. So yeah, that's an important, essential, foundational thing when it comes to coping, is being able to identify what you can control and controlling that. And if it's an environment like we're describing, and the pandemic's been full of that, actually practicing true compassion is a self-protective factor.
So 30 seconds could make a big difference.
That's it.
30 seconds.
They were talking to medical doctors in this, saying, yes, you only have 3 minutes per patient. Give 30 seconds of that to true attention and observation and connection, and you won't burn out as quickly. And that's what the study discovered, is that actually is what...
I'm sure we could all relate to that, right? That would help each and every one of us. This is for the entire panel, so anyone can jump in whenever you feel comfortable doing so. Is there a way to distance yourself from the negative part of the news, but still staying informed? Think about it for a second. Because just turning off the TV or turning off the radio or putting your cell phone in the drawer for a day, it's innate that we want to know what's going on. We want to know what's happening around us. But is there, and like I said, it's for anyone on the panel that wants to jump in. Glenn.
Yeah, I just want to say, first of all, I think it boils down to checking in and checking out. Knowing when to check in and knowing when to check out. So you need to know your baseline when you're going into the news. What is your tolerance level today? Because I can say there are some days I want to watch the news. I mean, it would be, I would miss it if I didn't. So if I can check in with myself and say, this is good space, I'm in the place where I want this information. So checking in is important, but then knowing when to check out. So if you find when you're watching the news that you're starting to notice that your mood's going down, you're deciding, I think probably a glass of wine would go really well now. And as you know, the pandemic has increased addictions to alcohol as well as the amount of overdoses with fentanyl and things like that, because people are self-medicating to deal with the stress of it. Yeah, check in when you're in the place that checking in is a healthy thing, but check out when it's time to check out. I usually recommend people hang in there with mindfulness for about 30 seconds to a minute before you just cut it off quickly, because you're reinforcing fear when you do that. That's not a healthy thing. But again, observe yourself. When you know it's time to check out, give yourself that space, and then after your minute or whatever, you can successfully walk away and feel good about it.
Anybody else want to comment?
I think I'll just add to what Glenn said. I was thinking it's really about being mindful, just mindful of what we consume, when we consume it, and how we consume it, and also being mindful of our sources. I mean, social media feed is not necessarily news. And we all have heard about, bubbles and how things can propagate. And, we can notice if we've gotten into a sphere where we're getting more of a negative news cycle and how that might be affecting us. So I think mindfulness in a choice of media, in when we consume it, how we consume it, and checking in on what our response is.
As somebody who can't turn it off, because that would be frowned upon if I wasn't informed. What I do is I have a no news policy at home. Once I leave the office, I simply do not consume news. I don't even consume social media, with the exception of Facebook, because my mother's in Florida and I want to keep in touch with her. So I do Facebook, but I found myself engaging with people on Facebook because I have this need to correct facts when they're wrong. So a really wise person, my co-host, actually Jason McCoy, said to me, don't engage. And at first it was really, really hard not to engage, because I like to think that I could fix everything that's wrong with the world, but clearly I can't do that. So I worked at it, and now I'm pretty good at not engaging. I don't even go on Twitter anymore because, frankly, that one's really rife with really some strong opinions that I would like to correct. But at home, no news, only family, and puzzles on my phone. I like to do puzzles to unwind and relax. So there's just a couple of, and obviously family,
right.
But take your mind off it. I take my mind off it that way, and I stay informed at work when I have to, and then I'm not.
Jason?
Yeah, just echo the comment of sort of self-awareness, right? Knowing the headspace that you're in to be able to manage it, and then consciously having the tools to be able to address it, right? Is this a day where I can consume headlines because that's really all I can manage right now to be able to, process it? Or is this a day where I really want to do the deeper dive, right? Like I need the New York Times article versus so that I can really understand what's going on. But you're not always in that headspace, right? At least personally. So doing that awareness check-in that we talked about is important.
There was a recent article in the American Psychological Association entitled "Media Overload. Is it hurting our mental health?" It says installing a few mental guardrails can help. I think we've started to get into this little bit of this conversation. It's suggested that people begin practicing dietary media restriction. And Carrie, that's what you're doing, right?
Now I have a name for it.
Okay, there you are. See, now when you can say, this is what I'm doing. What any of you've kind of shared with us already, and Glenn, I think you touched on it a little bit as well. Any suggestions on how to put yourself on a diet, so to speak, when it comes to media consumption, good and bad? Rebecca? Jason?
I call it attentional hygiene, which I think is also a term. But, not just with media, but, you really have one resource, and it's your attention. What do you pay attention to? And it can be media. You can make choices within that. One thing I wanted to add to what Jason said, I think it's so important, even when we have limited amounts of attention, that sometimes it's more important to read that one longer article rather than consume 30 headlines. Because reading one thing deeply can give you a much more nuanced understanding of a situation, whereas reading the headlines is going to always just be, the punch in the gut, the response, but not necessarily helping us to understand the complexities of a situation. So sometimes it's worth sitting down, read one longer article, and try to understand what's going on. I was also thinking with attentional hygiene and what you were saying about family. I learned another new term this week, phubbing. Have you heard of phubbing?
No.
Yeah, okay, so phubbing is when you feel snubbed because someone is looking at their phone instead of talking to you. Which I think is really classic. So one of the guardrails is a suggestion that, you know, like you said, family time, you know, there's no media. Like lots of people have a rule, no phones at the dinner table, or, you know, once we come in the door, we leave our phones aside, we pay attention to each other, because spending that time to connect, understand, have a real relationship with the people around us is really valuable. So sometimes we feel like we're connecting through our phones, but we might just be phubbing each other. Not productive.
So tonight we've learned about phubbing, and what was the other phrase?
Doom scrolling.
Doom scrolling. Okay, there'll be a quiz later on. So Jason.
Well, Scott, I know we're not supposed to do this, but I'd be interested in your perspective as a former mayor about how you manage, because it's one thing for us to say, you know, as a consumer of news, to turn it off. But if you're a politician and or you're getting messages either through social media or through your Facebook account or saying, you know, the road's got a big pothole in it, why aren't you doing something about it, Mr. Mayor? You know, and I'm going to hazard a guess, because I worked in the political sphere too, that, you know, most of it's negative. And yet at the same time, there's an expectation that you're doing something about it, right? That people have sent you this information and now things should happen. So how did you manage?
Oh, now you're going to ask me a question. Okay. We said it was going to be interactive. Here we go. Well, okay, let me tell you. I was a mayor for 12 years, so I saw a lot in 12 years. And I saw a lot of changes in government over that time. What the government did. Like, who can remember back in the late 90s when Mike Harris decided that the municipality was going to do everything and the province wasn't going to do anything anymore? So there was the big download, right? Everything got downloaded to the lower municipalities who had no money to pay for it, but they didn't care. So you guys figure it out. That was terrible. My first 3 years were just terrible because we didn't know it was even coming. It was going to be revenue neutral, which meant somebody got rich and somebody got poor. That's revenue neutral, right? Well, in Tay, we got poor. There was no way around it. We took a big shot, and we struggled for a lot of years to turn things around. I never got on Twitter because I always looked at Twitter hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So I never got on Twitter. I was on Facebook. I was the most boring guy in the world on Facebook because all that was missing was rainbows and roses and kitty cats, because mine was all positive, because I didn't want to get into the negative stuff because all the rest of my day was negative. I can only count on 30 hands how many times I was sworn at in public and how many times I was just abused verbally and physically over the years as a mayor. And you're supposed to keep going. You're not supposed to take it personally. Somebody once said to me, they're not angry with you. You just happen to be the person that's standing in front of them at the time.
They're
But
shooting the messenger?
You just don't shoot the messenger, okay? I didn't leave office because of that. I just left because I wanted to do other things. But it's a challenge. And I look around what goes on in all levels of politics now. And that's why voter turnout is 30%. Because they're sitting there saying, well, these guys aren't going to do anything anyway. So why should I bother? Well, that's the worst thing in the world, to be disengaged. So be engaged, be involved, because that's the only way things will change. So, like, if someone asked me what my coping mechanism was, well, my coping mechanism was to go from 300 pounds to 200 pounds. That was my coping mechanism, was to get myself in shape so I could carry on my life. That was my coping mechanism at that time, okay? So I moved on. So yeah, that is a challenge. And so the question I'm going to have back to you all now is, how do you cope? Okay? How do you cope?
Well, if I can stick with your initial question and weave that in, there's a proverb that says, if you find honey, eat just enough, otherwise you will vomit. And so when you talk about your mental hygiene in relation to how you consume the news. When you're starting to feel nauseated, then it's probably time to move on, is a good principle. There was a couple named Gay and Kathleen Hendricks, psychologists, who wrote a book back in the early 90s that had a real big impact on me. And the one piece that they said that I've carried with me, and I use this all the time in my work, preach it to the team that reports to me. And it's really essential to health and well-being and for coping. And it's counterintuitive at the beginning because it basically, because people don't want to feel bad. So when we feel bad, we want to do something to not feel bad. That's why the pharmaceutical companies make so much money off us, is because we want to solve our problems, like the microwave, not the crock pot. So what they said was, feel your feelings deeply. So you need to know what you're feeling, so dive right into them. And then they said, tell the microscopic truth. And the microscopic truth is, what's happening inside you based on that? Where are you feeling that in your body? In your stomach, in your skin, in your head, your stress in the back of your neck, what's happening? And then once you know that microscopic truth and you've felt your feelings deeply, you know that microscopic truth, the third thing is only make agreements you can keep. And the reason people overwhelm is because to save the moment and the stress of the moment and the expectations of the moment, people will often do what they need to do to get through this moment, take on a burden that they can't sustain. So if you know that what's being asked of you is beyond your capacity, better to have the right fight at the right time for the right reason than the wrong fight at the wrong time for the wrong reason. That's what will happen later down the road. So that's what I try to practice in my own life. Feel my feelings deeply, tell the microscopic truth, only make agreements I can keep. It makes me a pain in the butt a lot of the time in meetings, because if I'm not going to do it, I will tell my boss I can't do that. Sorry. Can't sustain that. No sense telling you I can. I'm not going to BS you on this. But that's I think a coda for life. So we don't sell ourselves short, make agreements in the moment to just relieve the stress of that particular time, and then carry a burden with us that's going to be with us a lot longer.
Anybody else? Just want to think about that for a second.
Well, something occurs to me. We did a team building thing last week at Chigamik. It was really fun. We had this group come in and we worked around the idea of joy. And it was really wonderful. But we started with this really simple exercise where we asked each other, what brings you joy? And I thought about it, and my response was the sky. And my partner said, well, that's good because it's always there. And I think we live in such a beautiful area. We're so fortunate. I think being able to walk outside and take a moment and, look at the sky, look at a tree, look at something that fills you with some awe, that connects you to something, and just take a moment to be present. I think that's my coping mechanism.
Jason?
Yeah, I do one of my former colleagues' brother used to say, do the checkup from the neck up. And so I will say that to myself regularly, depending on how I'm feeling. I would say that the self-care journey, I think, is something that we're all on at various stages, and I think is an important one. For me, it's about being curious about why I'm feeling the way I'm feeling. Like, what is causing that? And, for me, 9 times out of 10, it's not the thing that's in front of me right now. It's the stuff that's been kind of building up, or the fact that I haven't gotten outside to see the sun, or, the kids have been sick and so I'm sleep deprived, or, and just having that moment of curiosity about, like, what's really going on here? Oh, right. Oh, yeah, this stuff has been happening. How can I, reconnect with myself and do what I do to kind of de-stress? But I think that's becoming, I'm hoping, more and more acceptable, right? To sort of have the conversation out in the open with our colleagues and with our friends and our family about where are we on this mental hygiene, work that we're doing. And, for me with the news, to bring it back just for a moment, it's often for me, I will have the mental kind of check in my head to say, this terrible stuff is going on. How great is my life, right? That I'm not there and I'm not in Syria, and so flipping it kind of on its head, and obviously I'm not taking joy in other people's pain. That's terrible. But the idea that, we are very lucky, right? And we don't say that enough to ourselves or, to our colleagues. And we live in a great country and it's amazing. And, how do we remind ourselves of that, to counterbalance?
Anything to add, Carrie?
Yeah, music. For me, music. Music is a key for me. I love sitting out in my backyard at the bonfire. Nobody has to be there. It could be just me and a Bluetooth speaker, and I play all kinds of different music depending on my mood, and I get right into it. And I actually sing and dance, as my neighbors will attest, by myself. It sounds like I'm a weirdo, but I'm really not. I just really enjoy relaxing and unwinding with music. The other thing that I really find that helps me alleviate any of that anxiety, I'm thinking, knowing about, the earthquake and this and that, is just doing things in my own community. I love participating in, I MC a lot of charity events. I go to a lot of charity events. I participate in my community fully as much as I can, as long as it doesn't happen after 7 o'clock at night, generally speaking.
Yes, Carrie is staying up late tonight to do this show with us, by the way. But she took tomorrow off.
So I have a lot of causes that are near and dear to my heart, and I put a lot of effort into those things. And just seeing that it makes a difference in other people's life. I think actually that comes back to what Glenn was saying about the compassion. Just actually acknowledging, I went to a snowmobile run 2 weeks ago, and yeah, it was a lot of fun, but there were women there that are struggling with breast cancer, and yet they were there on their machines, and we acknowledged them, and we helped as much as we could, and I came away from that weekend feeling completely energized, even though I got very little sleep and probably did things that I probably shouldn't have done. I still came away very energized and feeling really good, so I think that's part of it. Doing what you can good in your own community really makes you feel good, and it does the world good.
Now, my broadcasting career ended in 1997, but I kept disc jockeying, right? I kept playing and everything else. And all during my political career, I was disc jockeying. Every Saturday night, I was somewhere, doing a wedding or an anniversary or a party or whatever. That was my great release from all the other stuff that was going on around me. Because when I was there, I was just old Scotty. That's who I was. I wasn't the other guy. I wasn't the guy that got yelled at because the road wasn't plowed or the ditch wasn't dug. I was just the guy I was old Scotty. And much like Carrie, after my career ended, I went into politics because I saw that being my way of continuing to give to the community. So there is a lot of truth in that, giving back to the community and paying it forward. That old expression, I think, really does help each and every day when you are facing this constant bubble of negativity around you. And speaking of that, I want to talk about social media. We talked a little bit about it.
My existence.
I personally think social media will be the death of Western civilization as we know it, but that's just my opinion. But the danger with social media and the news is that they're designed to create content. And you mentioned when we got together that you are now a content creator.
I'm a content creator. I'm
so
disc jockey, a podcaster.
Yeah. So social media, it's based on your likes and your interests and your clicks, which ends up basically being an echo chamber. You are talking to yourself. You're screaming to yourself more than anything else. It's an environment where a person only encounters information or opinions that reflect or reinforce their own. So that's their view of the world is their view and nobody else's. And I think that's where the term fake news was born. Because if I don't believe in it, it's got to be, if I don't think it's true, then it's a lie. No. You might not believe it, but it still happened. It's still happening. It's still going on. But in your little world, it's not. That's the personal struggle. And that's why social media is such, I think, a dangerous, dangerous weapon. And that's the word for it. It's a weapon. Because it is really, really making it difficult for the positive in the world, the good stuff, to get through. So you've talked a bit about how you manage your dietary thing about social media. What about the rest of you? And I'll come back to you, Carrie. So, Rebecca, are you on social media, and to what extent?
You know, barely, Scott. I actually went on Facebook to post about this event tonight to encourage people to come, and I realized I hadn't opened my Facebook account for several weeks. I think that...
And Facebook reminds you that you haven't opened your account for several weeks.
Well, no, I just look at the last thing I posted. I was like, that was a while ago. I kind of use it now. I use Facebook Marketplace. It's like the Kijiji of people that you know. That's kind of useful. But it's interesting. I don't know how many of you have friends or family members that maybe have very different interests or political views than your own. But one of the things I found is really interesting is that sometimes I'll talk to someone and I'll ask them about something that, you know, I'm aware of, and they're aware of completely different things. So there is this capacity to have these kind of very specialized news feeds that do, it's an echo chamber. It's that term has been used. You know, you're going to see the same things that you're looking at. I think now with the advances in AI, soon the bots will take over. Everything is just going to be streamlined. We won't need to engage with it anymore. Chat GPT is going to give you specialized content.
That's right.
Yeah.
Want to follow that, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, listen, we're trying not to doomsday tonight, but there's a great article in the Globe not long ago, a couple of weeks ago, that talked about, you know, it's even more insidious than what you're saying, Scott, because the profit is made on social media from the amount of time that your eyeballs are on the platform. So the algorithms are designed to, you know, entice you to stay on the platform, because the longer you're on it, the more advertising dollars the platform generates, right? And we all sort of know this, but I'm not sure we've realized, or maybe we're just realizing now, you know, how insidious that is. That, you know, it's because the algorithm is learning that the more disastrous, the more emotional reaction it can get from you, if I can put it that way. I'm not a tech person, but the more likely you are to keep your eyeballs on the platform, right? And so we know that the algorithms are learning this way, and we're not really ethically engaging with this problem. And then you have this echo chamber that gets created where you start to believe, you know, this kind of negativity that you're seeing. So I personally don't do it other than for work, because I just I do enough of it for work. So that's it for me. And I much prefer, you know, reaching out by text, email, or call, or have dinner with a friend, for example, as opposed to, you know, engaging through that. Plus, my aunt posts like every dinner that she's, you know, and it's beautiful and looks amazing, but like, I can't cook like that, so why do I have... Anyway. Love you, Aunt Carol Ann.
Glenn?
Well, I have no social media accounts whatsoever. And I agree the algorithms are evil, and that should be a moral concern to every one of us. But the reason I don't, well, let me be honest. My wife is on Facebook because we have a daughter living in England. We have two living in the States, and it's a way to keep connected with them. I have two sons that are barely on it, but sometimes they're there as well. So I will lurk on occasionally to see what's happening with the family. But I have no accounts myself. One of the reasons why I resist all of it, in the late 90s, I was part of a listserv. This is before social media. So for those of you who don't know what a listserv is, it's one email account that everybody emails, and everybody who's part of the listserv gets every email that is sent from everyone. And so it was like an early form of social media, but it was not, you could read it when you had time. Well, I got sucked into some controversial discussions. And I had the belief in those days, when I was younger, that the way to argue your point was to identify the boat they're in, sink it, and then float the life raft over so they'll hop into and get rescued, right? So
I'm just working on that picture for a second, Glenn, really.
I'm sad to say I preached that way early as well. Ministry, when I was in congregational ministry for 21 years. It's not a healthy way to be. So I just decided I'm not arguing with people about things that aren't going to change their mind. Usually information is not the problem, it's something else. If information is the problem, information is not the answer. There's no sense in engaging. Social media has so much of that. And when you look at the effect of bullying on our young people, and the bullying that occurs over social media is more destructive than the actual face-to-face bullying. And we haven't solved that problem yet, but kids are killing themselves over it. That should all be of concern. So all of that to say, yeah, I'm not interested in LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. Bring it home. Something else?
Well, I worry all the time because news stories, anybody can post news. And I got my paper out here because I just wanted to say, according to StatsCan, Canadians spend an average of 326 minutes a day on digital media. 326 minutes a day, and it's growing. And when they talk to younger people, people 35 and older are more likely to consume news outside of social media. Younger people are getting most of their news from social media, and anybody can post a news story, and it's not necessarily factual. And unlike us, like there's no journalistic principles that they're using to post these stories. It's basically their opinion, and there's nobody that vets it. There's nobody that, like, if you're a journalist and you print an article in the paper and you've printed a falsehood, there's corrections, there's litigation, there's all kinds of consequences that can come back to you, including losing your job. But, my cousin Joe doesn't necessarily lose his job over something that he posts on social media, although that has happened. Like, not my cousin Joe, but just, Joe, the cousin guy. Because and then there's people that go on there and they refute actual real stories with real facts, saying, well, my cousin Joe says this. And cousin Joe may not be an expert in the field, may not have gone to school for that particular skill, doesn't work in the field, and yet he has an opinion about it. And when you were talking earlier, one of the biggest sayings around our station is, don't let a good fact ruin your opinion. Do you know what I mean? Because a lot of people have them. Everybody's got one. I think there's a saying somewhere in there. Algorithms, you were talking about algorithms. That's a set of rules that the social media platforms don't share what these actual rules are. So there's all these rules that go into your news feed. Like you might look at your news feed and you go, why have I not seen anything from Angela lately? And it's because Angela doesn't keep you go. Maybe Angela agrees with you all the time. So they're not going to show you what Angela is saying because they want people like me to get upset and anxious and agitated and think people are the worst. And it's one of those things. And I think I agree with you, Scott, when you say I think this will be the downfall of us, because really you get these silos, what you guys were talking about, and then all of the things that feed into those to keep you going, as you were saying, to keep you on looking and engaged, commenting, and feeling anxious. So it's all designed to make you feel that way. And I play a part in it, which just drives me insane, but it's part of my job. I'm required as part of my job description to post to our website, to post to Facebook, And then, and I mean, I'm actually supposed to be posting to Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. What's the newest one? There's all, like, it's never ending. And, you know, you only have so many hours in a day, and apparently a lot of us are spending it doing this. And
So-
I just think it's
So
terrible.
326 minutes?
Yes, that was in.
Okay, so it's 5.5 hours a day. You think we'd go to sleep for 8 of it. And somewhere in there, we'd be working. So I'm just trying to figure out how much time at work people are spending not working. You know, like they're on their phone or they're whatever. The bane of my existence was some guy told me.
Oh.
The classic one. Well, how'd you find? Well, some guy told me. Okay, fine. My line at the township was, I'd say, well, call the office, and it says, put in the name of the person you want to speak to, and I would say, type in some guy told me, and see if somebody answers. And the day they answer is the day that I'm going to leave, but it never happened. We're just racing along here, I'll tell you. I've got a couple of more questions. And this one I think I really want to drill down on this one, because we've talked about misinformation and everything else, but how do we debunk it? Okay? There was an editorial in the Toronto Star about 3 weeks ago, entitled "The High Cost of Misinformation." Falsehoods, lies, misinformation take a toll on our civic debate, which we've talked about, right? Some guy told me. Our ability to make an informed decision. It erodes the trust in institutions, right? Right? Fake news. The government's, Bill Gates put microchips in the vaccine, whatever. Our ability to make an informed decision, and it exacerbates social divides, right? It's the us against them mentality, and it's put our health at risk. And we all know in the case of the pandemic, that toll was steep. That's the only way to describe it. The cost to the healthcare system through the whole pandemic was because I'm not going to get vaccinated because of, put your answer in here. And how much that cost to put a figure on it, it was hundreds of millions of dollars on the healthcare system, right? Because of that, I don't believe it. And you can't make me believe it. So I guess the question would be, do you have any ideas or any suggestions on how we debunk the information effectively? And how do we avoid bringing more attention to the wrong information? And that, I think, is a real battle. Because how do you win the war when a lot of times, it's a one-person newsroom, I have standards, I have guidelines that I live by at my workplace, everything else. How do you debunk that information? You're sitting there and your hair is on fire because you know it's not true, but what can you do to debunk it? Glenn, I know you want to say something.
Yeah, I'm going to give a clinical technique that I use that is helpful. It's what you do when you're approaching someone who has a delusion, actually. It's the same process. People get distracted by the flower, the visible manifestation of a thing, and don't pay attention to the root, what is producing that visible manifestation. I don't know whether you can debunk what a person actually believes. I think the only hope you have of communicating is forgetting about the flower and being curious about what's underneath it. I'll give you one example. One of the individuals who left Waypoint during the time when there was a requirement that everybody be vaccinated in order to work during the time when there was real concern about spread within healthcare facilities. When I did that with this individual, cared less about the flower of I'm not getting that vaccine, and dug down. This person was part of a family whose parents had survived through the Nazi experiments during World War II. And so there was strong mistrust when it came to medical procedures having to do with the government. So is that what's going on in Canada when we're making vaccine mandates? No. Is that a concern to somebody who's lived through a time in history where that was very much a concern and things happened? You know, we did that to Indigenous people with what they called the Indian hospitals, where the same experiments the Nazis were doing were being done on Indigenous people. Do you think Indigenous people aren't going to be concerned about what the kinds of experiments might be being done on them in the name of medicine? Of course they will, if that's a part of their learned experience. So I find when you're talking to an individual who requires debunking in our minds, being curious about the root behind that, you know, because these things don't just fall from the sky. There's something underneath it. Getting at that is going to be a more helpful conversation than pointing out how ridiculous they are to think in this way.
Jason.
Yeah, I think we have struggled with this one because, you know, you'll see something posted that says, you know, something untrue about hospital care or the hospital or something they've heard from Cousin Joe. And you know, our staff in particular will sort of say, like, why aren't you getting on there and telling them that that's not right and giving them the truth about what the situation is? And I think we, you know, that's our instinct too, is we want to correct the information. We want to provide the source of truth. Haven't had a lot of luck doing that kind of direct, you know, no, you're wrong, actually we're right, and this is why. It doesn't seem to work all that well, shockingly. So the tact we've often taken is, okay, if there is confusion about this kind of thing or this issue or this procedure or the process, how can we make sure that we are pushing out the way to access the correct information, right? So how to have that source of truth so that if you are interested and you're activated enough about this issue, that you will look for it. I mean, we all know how to kind of Google search and find things, and we have our own hopefully developed instincts about, you know, Cousin Joe's Facebook page versus, you know, the media site. And so we want to make sure that the right information is available and out there, and you know, push it so that people at least understand where they can go get that information. It doesn't solve the problem, I don't think, but it's at least one more step, you know, that we can try to address this issue.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I think things like what we're doing here tonight, to be conscious about the way that we consume media, are incredibly important. This idea that, you know, the average Canadian spending 5 hours and 26 minutes looking at social media, or at least looking at their device. I think if we realize that the influence of things like confirmation bias, that, you know, if you're spending 5.5 hours, but that 5.5 hours is looking quickly for things that confirm what you already believe, that's very different from spending 5.5 hours deeply diving into an issue and maybe reading some primary sources and doing a bit of that harder work to try to understand an issue. So I think if we realize that, you know, the thing that often drives our attention is not maybe in our own best interest, and feeding our confirmation bias is also not in our own best interest, because it's not really helping us to understand the issue, it's just amplifying what we already knew. So we're not growing our knowledge base. I'm a researcher, I'm involved in research, and one of the main things with research is you have a hypothesis, and if you're proven wrong, that's actually a great thing, because you've learned something. You've learned that what you thought when you set out with your hypothesis was incorrect. There's something more you could learn. There's more information that you've added to this story. So I think we should all maybe have a little bit more of a research hat on when we go and consume media, and look to be proven wrong. Seek out the things that we didn't understand or that we didn't know when we started our journey of reading.
Carrie?
Just a couple of things. I have to make a distinction between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation can be shared accidentally or thinking that it's real and sharing it. Disinformation is creating it knowing that you're going to share it, and it's actually manipulating the truth or the data or the figures to the way that you believe, and to a certain end. So there's something that you want to accomplish through that. The other thing that I would say is these social media sites are publishers. They need to be treated like publishers. like the same rules that newspapers and radio stations and TV stations have to follow. These are also publishers. They should be following those same rules, and I feel very strongly about that. Because I can't just go on the radio and say, you know, something wrong about you that I know is a lie and not get called on it and potentially lose my job. So I really think that they're publishers.
Well, it's interesting. You get into the whole freedom of speech thing and everything else. You still can't yell fire in a theater. That's not infringing on anybody's rights. It's the law that you can't do that. And they say it's about freedom of speech. There is no freedom for hate speech. And that goes back to your bullying comment, Glenn, about all the stuff that goes on social media.
Rights and responsibilities.
Yep. We're almost to the end of the program. I'm going to give the guests a couple of minutes, just a couple of minutes, because I want to get from each and every one of you a positive note to leave us on. Okay, so I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about that. I mentioned off the top of the program, this is the 45th in this series, and a program like this does not happen without some wonderful sponsors. And I'd like to thank our sponsors, and there they are up on the screen. 7 very supportive sponsors who donate their funding and their goodwill. We have Audia Hearing Aid Center with offices throughout Simcoe County. Georgian Bay General Hospital, which has been a long-time supporter of this program. The Center for Psychology and Emotional Regulation, headed by Anita Federici. She's been a guest many times on this program as well. Hillcrest Village Care Center for long-term care, home managed by the Enns family. The Waypoint Center for Mental Health Care. Mink Insurance, led by Dave Mink, now known as McDougall Insurance. And last but not least, Lois Lipton, Georgian North Real Estate Limited, providing commercial real estate and development services in Simcoe County. I'm going to give each of you 1 minute, and I can watch the clock, okay? If you've ever watched The National, at the end of the newscast, they have the moment, which is always a good news story. So in a minute, share something positive for us to take home. Carrie, go.
Where is the positive news? It is literally everywhere. But it's not going to come and find you. You have to actually seek it out. But when you do, you can find it. And there's to paraphrase Fred Rogers, he said his mother, when he was little, told him, when something bad happened, look for the people who are helping. So, for example, the earthquake in Turkey, there was a team from Burnaby, BC that went over there totally they just self-deployed there to try and help people out of the rubble. The Russian attack on Ukraine, there is a woman in Collingwood who got together with some friends, hooked up with a Rotary Club, and raised $100 million worth of medical supplies to send to Ukraine. Those are stories that I have on my website right now and on my social media. And if you want positive stories, they're there. Find them and share them and like them. Do it.
That's your minute. Rebecca.
So, your attention is a precious resource. Don't waste it. Take a moment to go pay attention to something that is going to fill you up. Bestow it on someone with some compassion, and it's going to come back to you. So we create that positivity, and you can use your attentional window to help grow that for yourself and for the people around you in your community.
Thank you. Jason.
So one of the things that came out of the pandemic was the staff at RVH created a program called RISE, which was to help each other be resilient through these challenging times. And it was voluntary. So they would voluntarily offer to take calls from their colleagues who were feeling really down or distressed, burnt out, And, you know, they're not professionals who were taking the calls, but just the ability, the camaraderie that was there. And I think, you know, that's where we need to look, right? Is how do we support each other? How do you be there for each other? How do you open up to have those opportunities to support each other? And I think that's one of the things that we'll be taking out of the pandemic for sure.
Thank you, Jason. Glenn.
I'd just like to remind everyone to follow your bliss, at least at some point in time in your day. Nobody is any good for anyone else if you're not taking care of yourself and finding your own peace. And perhaps an emotional form of, and I can never remember her name, Kim something, who says, grab an item, hold it. If it doesn't give you good energy, throw it out, you know. I can't remember her name, but there's
Marie Kondo.
Pardon me? Oh, Marie Kondo, that's it, yes. So practice that emotionally and make sure that you're taking self-care as part of your day.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you, the audience here at the MCC, those on TV, watching on Rogers Cable, and also online. Let's have another big round of applause for our wonderful speakers. Thank you for sharing with us your personal experience and really telling us how we can get through this, how we can do ourselves a favor each and every day. In the famous words of Fraser Crane, eat a cookie. We will see you again in 9 weeks minus 1 day on Wednesday, April 19th, 2023. The title for the evening will be The Difference Sex and Gender Make in Our Health. Our speakers will be Dr. Anna Dukas, vascular surgeon at the Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre. Monica Menicola, she's the Regional Integration Lead with Osteoporosis Canada for the Ontario Osteoporosis Strategy. And Sandra Eason-Bruno, Director of the North Simcoe Muskoka Specialized Geriatric Services. Please take the opportunity to watch this program again or recommend it to your family and friends. You may even post it somewhere, right? Tell them all about it. You can view it on Rogers TV. It airs 10 times per week for Rogers subscribers. I think I might just watch it once and realize what a fool I made of myself up here. But anyway, I would like to thank Dr. Keith Rose, who's in the Carolinas. Keith, thank you for letting me try to fill your incredibly talented shoes. I did have fun tonight. You know, I think we learned something. I think we had a good time. And at the end of the day, I think we're all just a little better off. You can watch it, as I said, 10 times per week for Rogers subscribers or on demand. For anyone, there's also the YouTube link, which will be posted at the MCC Our Health website. Once again, to our panelists, to our wonderful sponsors, and each and every one of you who came out this evening to find out more about how you can confront negative news. Sometimes it's just as simple as Glenn said, taking 30 seconds of compassion in your day to make a difference on so many ways. We'll see you again on April the 19th. Have yourself a great evening.
Call the Rogers TV Viewer Response Line, email us, or connect with us on